So our lecture for today is audience analysis from chapter 3 of your textbook. And we will focus on 5 main ideas. Number 1, checking out your speech location, the questions to ask. Who is your audience? Gathering information about your audience psychology. It's so important to understand psychology, human psychology, and the study of rhetoric and the study of persuasion. And then finally, feelings. Understanding feelings and your audience disposition so that you can best relate to and adapt to your audience. So a few weeks ago, I was asked to give a talk at a local organization, and the topic was how to manage difficult conversations. There were 3 main categories of questions that I asked the person. Number 1, where was I going to be speaking? Number 2, what were the technologies that they had at that particular location? Did I have access to a computer, to a projector? Can I use PowerPoint? Was I going to be using a microphone? And then number 3, how large the audience was going to be. So how many people were going to be there? And then what types of people? And we'll talk about audience demographics in a minute. Moving back to technology, or going back to technology, if you are using a microphone, know that you do not have to project your voice as if you were yelling to them so that they can hear you. You would want to speak very naturally in your natural voice. You really don't want to project as much as you would without a microphone. And the other thing to know is that I cannot tell you how many times I have seen speakers at events not adjust the microphone to their height and get it at the appropriate location for them to speak well. And I've seen, there's a colleague of mine at almost every honors convocation. He never adjusts the mic, and he just bends down and he speaks into the microphone like that, because the person usually before him is a little bit shorter than he is. So you have the power. Don't be afraid. Take that mic and make sure that you adjust it so that it is at the right level for you to be heard well. And then the last thing that I wanted to mention about audience size is typically the general rule of thumb is that the larger the audience, the more formal your presentation, your speech is going to be. That is not always the case, but that's generally the case. But you, as a speaker, need to do your homework and figure out whether or not you need to be very formal or less formal or kind of somewhere in between. Moving on to our next slide. So who is your audience? You want to know who you're talking to. And in communication, we define our self-concept as how we would describe ourselves to other people. Now, our self-esteem is connected to our self-concept. Our self-esteem is how we evaluate what we have just described about ourselves to other people. So the two are interconnected. Now, why do you need to know your audience's self-concept? Why do you need to learn about them? Because typically our self-concept, how we would describe ourselves, will in part determine how we present ourselves to the world. And how we present ourselves to the world is how we would like to be seen. So you as a speechwriter have to understand that people want to be seen in a certain way. So it's your job to affirm or to at least recognize the identity of your audience, the concepts of your audience, to affirm them in some way or other. So it's really important to know what are their self-concepts. This is their presenting self. This is how they're presenting themselves to the world. And then how can you establish some identification by recognizing them and by seeing them as they wish to be seen. Number 2, we'll talk more specifically about identity characteristics and doing your demographic analysis, which is extremely important in writing a speech. Number 3, avoiding stereotyping. So we know that our brains are hardwired to stereotype. We absolutely know that. But part of our goal in teaching you the art of rhetoric as educators is for you to go beyond the stereotype that you've been conditioned to think or to believe about particular groups of people, and to make educated assumptions, if you will, or to do the research that you need, or to meet the people that you've made these assumptions about. And then number 4, you must study commonalities of group identities. But going back to, even though you're studying the commonalities, the paradox here You also want to study some of the common assumptions that we make from these generalities that we're making, and then what could go wrong with that. So it is a catch-22 in some ways. We do have to make some assumptions. We do have to stereotype sometimes. We do have to make generalizations sometimes, but also as speechwriters, we have to go beyond that type of conditioning as well. So it's a catch-22, I am not going to lie. And if you were in my advanced rhetoric class, we would talk more about this. But we are going to talk more about this. But we would talk about some of the strategies that we can use as speechwriters. Okay, so in demography and stereotyping, so demography as a student of speech, so all these beautiful faces right here, say hello. So as a student of speech, you have to understand demography. What is it? It's the study of statistical characteristics of a given population. If you have checked your mail lately, you may have received a U.S. Census Bureau. And part of the reason why the government sends those surveys out is so that they can collect data and then they can make generalizations about the types of programs that are needed in a particular area, perhaps facilities that are needed, such as an ER or a trauma center. So that's really important to the federal government so that they can in turn help out state governments and then local governments to make decisions. So demography is really important to really understand and study the statistical characteristics of a given population. This demographic information that we get really provides you as the speaker with a basic understanding of your audience. But going back to stereotyping, what is it? It's an overgeneralization about a person or a group based on assumed characteristics. So we want to try to get away from stereotyping, even though we all do it. As a speaker, it would not behoove you to stereotype your audience at all. So the example that I have is this. This is case in point. So take a look at this gentleman. And if you read your textbook, chapter 3, you would see that this man is not as he would appear. So did you stereotype this gentleman? Maybe you did, maybe you didn't. It doesn't matter. But the point that I'm making is that most people probably did stereotype him. And if you did, you may not realize that when this man wrote an ad for an online dating service, that he is a self-identified Catholic, that during his day job, he wears Brooks Brothers clothing, that he is looking for a woman that is well educated and that is adventurous. And also he would like to share his time with someone that would enjoy the same activities that he does and interest, and also wouldn't mind helping him start up a poodle breeding business. Would you ever assume that based on looking at him? Probably not. Case in point. Stereotyping gets us into trouble. Okay, so now we're going to break down demographics, and the first one is age. And if you look in your textbook on page 55, I'm not going to go through each one, but it breaks down the different life crises that we go throughout our lives, how to appeal to certain groups based on their generation. So again, like I said, we have to make some generalizations, but we also have to look at people as individuals as well. So we have to some degree, but not fully. So if you look at the life crises and overview at the model on page 55, it just really breaks down how to best appeal to specific age groups. So how you would appeal to a child if you want a child to comply. If you try to reason it out with a child, if let's say they're 5 years old and you try to give them a really good argument as to why they shouldn't do that, that's not going to work. But what might work is that you use fun words, or you focus on the present by promising perhaps a toy or promising a trip to Disney World. So that might work with appealing to a child to get them to comply. We want to make sure that we know who we're talking to the various groups. So make sure that you look through through the life crisis overview on page 55 of your textbook. And to simplify it, Aristotle said that there are 3 basic groups of people. So not the 5 that's listed in your textbook, but he talks about the 3 basic groups of people that you're going to be speaking to. Younger people, so these are the teens, early young adults, he would say, so let's say your early 20s. He would say those people are much more likely to be quick to jump on the bandwagon, be quick to get angry, be quick to be indifferent, be quick to join a cause, but also be quick to quit a cause. They're much more into extremes. He said that middle-aged people, they're the more rational of all the groups. They're more well-tempered, and you cannot go to extremes with the middle-aged people. You can provide a strong, solid argument. You don't want to rely too heavily on emotional appeals like you can for younger people, and overall tend to focus on common ground and logic to best persuade this particular group of people. And then the older people, he said they're cynical, and they are going to think that they know more than you. They've been there, they've done that, they've seen that, nothing is new. So this is what Aristotle had to say about the 3 different age groups. It is a little bit more nuanced than that, so make sure that you go to your textbook and look at page 55. Now moving on to sex and gender. So your sex is your biology, so sex is biological, and then gender is really kind of how we perform our sex. And gender is mutable. How we perform our gender is really based on the culture that we live in. Your culture has a set of social norms or expectations of how you are supposed to perform your gender. And if you defy those norms, then you could be outcasted, or you might be looked upon as different. So as a public speaker, you want to take sex, the biological sex of your audience, into consideration, and their gender also into consideration. Now, I had a student years ago, and his speech was about persuading the audience to do self-breast exams and to get checkups. Now, this was a young gentleman, and he was in his mid-20s, and he had a certain type of ethos in which he had a better chance at persuading some of the males than perhaps a female would have had. And he had breast cancer at his very young age. And he shared that with his audience. And it was the first time I've heard other speeches about self-breast exams and persuading people to get checked early in life. And not once have I ever seen the males in my classroom listen and hang on every word of the speaker. And so this young gentleman really had a credibility with the audience because of his sex and because he had breast cancer. And that's not something that people expected a young man to ever get. So you do have to take into consideration the sex and the gender of your audience. And moving on to sexual orientation and identity. So sexual orientation and identity is also something that you need to be mindful of when analyzing your audience and when writing your speech. Because in North America, speakers have a tendency to assume that everyone is heterosexual. And we know that that is not the case. Everyone is not heterosexual. So you need to get that as a speaker and use more inclusive language. Even when you're talking to a large group of people, you don't know their backgrounds. And you may not be able to get that information. You may not be able to formally survey your audience. So what can you do? You can use more inclusive language to include people of all particular groups so that you're not making the assumption that someone is heterosexual. And a simple way to do that is, instead of using boyfriend, girlfriend, or husband, wife, just use the term partner. Partner is much more inclusive than focusing specifically on it has to be a husband or it has to be a wife, assuming that heterosexuality is what is considered to be the norm. Or not what is the norm, but what should be the norm. We have to be really careful of the shoulds as speech writers. So we want to kind of step away from the shoulds. Well, people should be this way, or they should should be that way. And you don't want to think like that if you want to be a good speechwriter. So it's really important, again, like I said, be inclusive. And there was a speaker, and so his name is Harvey Milk. He was the first openly gay elected official, and he had the gift of oratory. Not only did he have the gift, but he also had the education, he had the brain, and he had the heart, and he was able to connect people. So I want to give you an example, a beautiful example of a speech, Give Them Hope, that is inclusive, that inspires you, irrespective of what your sex is, what your gender is, what your sexual orientation is, what your race is, what your ethnicity is, what your socioeconomic status is, what your group membership is. He was able to include people, not exclude people. And that is something we as speakers need to strive for. So I'd like you to take a listen to that.
Somewhere in Des Moines or San Antonio, there's a young gay person who all of a sudden realizes that she or he is gay, knows that if the parents find out, they'll be tossed out of the house. The classmates would taunt the child, and the Anita Bryans and John Briggs are doing their bit on TV, and that child had several options. Staying in a closet, suicide, and then one day that child might open a paper and it says homosexual elected in San Francisco, and there are two new options. The option is to go to California, stay in San Antonio and fight. 2 days after I was elected, I got a phone call, and the voice was quite young. It was from Altoona, Pennsylvania, and the person said, "Thanks. And you've got to elect gay people so that that young child and the thousands upon thousands like that child know that there's hope for a better world. There's hope for a better tomorrow. Without hope, not only gays, but those blacks and the Asians and the disabled, the seniors, the us's, without hope, the us's give up. I know that you cannot live on hope alone, but without it, life is not worth living. And you've got to give them hope. Thank you very much.
You got to give them hope. So in a little bit, we'll talk about identification, but if you as a speaker can get that your audience wants to connect with you, and if you can include them, and the more people you include in your audience, the better. The chance for you connecting with your audience, the chance that you will have to open them to persuading them or open them to hearing what you have to say is far greater when people feel appreciated, when people feel included, when people feel like they can connect and they can relate. So he is an example of a speaker that was able to do this beautifully. So moving on to racial and ethnic identification, it's very important that as public speakers that we're very sensitive also to race and ethnic identification. And it will make you a more effective speaker. So race indicates a group of people identified as having the same or physical characteristics based on genetic heritage, visible traits, or social relationships. And a concept that overlaps a bit with race is ethnicity. And ethnic identification is understanding oneself to either share or participate in the language, in the culture, or in the style of a given group of people. It's important, irrespective of what your race is, it's important that you acknowledge the diversity of your audience. And there might be a myriad of races. So if you are white and you are delivering a speech to a mixed audience, and when I say mixed audience with regards to race, So you could have people that are Asian, you could have people that are African American, you could have people that are Hispanic in your audience. You need to be conscious of that. And same thing. If you are if you're a speaker that is African American and you're speaking to a diverse group as well, you're speaking to a group of white people or a group of Asian people or a group of mixed people, you too want to make sure that you're conscious of the race of your audience. And race is something that's very, very difficult for people in this country to talk about, but it's important that we have conversations so that we can better understand each other. And also, as a speaker, you have to cultivate, to be a really good speaker, you have to cultivate an understanding of our U.S. history. And especially in speaking about a topic that does evoke some type of racial differences, you have to have a historical consciousness and an understanding of the history of this country, because there have been well-documented examples of violence toward people of color in the United States. Well documented. And as a speaker, we all need to, irrespective of our race, have an understanding of that and a consciousness. And it is also, in addition to African American people, Native Americans in the 19th century were pretty much wiped out. So you could say almost a complete genocide of Native Americans, not fully, but almost. And the discrimination and the racism that they felt as well. And after World War II, we have Japanese Americans as well that faced great racism. And racism is alive and well in this country. But as a public speaker, part of your ethical responsibility is to acknowledge the diversity of your audience, to also acknowledge your own background and how that perhaps shapes your worldview, and understand that your worldview may not be someone else's worldview. And it's really important to get that as a student of speech. Your worldview may not be someone else's worldview. And you have to educate yourself. You have to understand. That's why history is so important to rhetoricians, to public speakers. You have to know your history so that you can best connect with people and that you can include and not exclude people, to create common ground, to create identification. Another demographic is socioeconomic status, the occupations and educational background of a given group of people. Sometimes we reduce this to just be about social class, and that's part of it, but it's also about different occupations. It's also about education. As a student of speech, it's important to understand the socioeconomic status of the group that you're presenting to, because it does play a role in how people perceive and receive the information that you're sending to them. So one of the things that you would want to take into consideration if you were trying to persuade a group of people, and let's just say that you wanted to persuade a group of wealthy people to make an investment, the logic and the examples that you use is going to be quite different than what the argument that you would make to a group of middle-class people, or even of people that are struggling to make ends meet. So it's really important to know where people are coming from, to know also their level of education, and also to know what their occupation is. And then finally, just overall group membership. It's important to know what the background is with regards to religion, to politics, occupations, organizations, kind of all of the above. It's important to know what groups that people belong to so that you can best persuade them. And we could go on and on about this, but I'm sure you do not want to be here all night. Okay, so moving on to gathering information about your audience, you can do an informal analysis, or where you just kind of ask questions, you try to get educated about the group of people that you're going to be presenting to. You do it all pretty informally, and then you can also do a more formal audience analysis. We won't have time for that in this class, but if you were going to give a presentation somewhere else or at an event, maybe you would conduct an interview. Maybe you would conduct a focus group where you would ask questions to a group of people, and then you would learn kind of how they feel about a particular situation or a problem. And then you could use that information to best adapt your message to the people that you'll be presenting to. And then even surveys can help you to gain information about your audience. Moving on to psychology and identification, I cannot stress how important human psychology is in the art of rhetoric and persuasion. So yes, this gentleman over here is Sigmund Freud. He's a 19th century physician from Vienna, or he was, and he really coined the term or the concept psychoanalysis too. He was really groundbreaking in the research that he did on how people think and feel. And although many of his theories have been disproven, he still contributed greatly to the fields of psychology and also to some of the literary disciplines as well. And he contributed to rhetoric. So what he says is that most people deep down share common motives and desires. So we share them. We might be different in how we try to achieve those desires and what is motivating us, but he kind of did something called dream analysis and these dreams that people were having. And based on the dreams that they were having, you could analyze the dream and uncover unconsciously and make it conscious what their motives and their desires were. And what he found was that really deep down, we all want to be loved. And why should you, as a student of speech, care about that? Because if you get that we all want to be loved, then you have a full understanding of how important it is for you as a speaker to be able to establish identification with your audience, because people want to be seen. Everyone wants to be seen. Everyone wants to be loved. And you need to get that. And then that's how you can connect, when you sincerely get that. And you sincerely make an effort to be able to identify and connect with people. Does anyone know who this man is? Probably not. You probably don't, and that's totally okay. This man is Kenneth Burke, and Kenneth Burke is known as the father of modern rhetoric. Kenneth Burke was born in the late 1800s, and he died in the early 1990s. And he has contributed greatly to the field of literature, literary criticism, and also to rhetoric. And in his writing, A Rhetoric of Motives in 1950, he wrote that rhetoric or persuasion is central to any study of the human condition. And he defined rhetoric as the use of language as a symbolic means of inducing cooperation in beings that by nature respond to symbols. So the key concept to Burke's rhetoric is identification. And identification is a recognition of common interest or common substance with other humans and is based on the ever-present opposite of identification, division. So what does rhetoric do? Rhetoric preserves or alters social order by influencing the way people perceive their symbolic relations. So what does all that mean? Is that we use our words, we use the art of rhetoric, we use our delivery to be able to connect with people, so that, let's say you have two groups of people who see themselves very, very differently. You find that single thread, that common thread that connects us all and that unites us, so that people have an opportunity to see a new reality. And that is the skilled rhetorician, and that is something that all speakers can strive for. Think about, how can I best find that single thread that can connect with my audience, to my audience, through my audience, so that we can be united. And it's not easy to do, but the more you learn about how to identify with people, the more you learn about human psychology, the more you have the opportunity to become a better public speaker. So yes, love and identification. We as human beings have the desire for connection and autonomy. I teach an interpersonal class, and this is one of the dialectical tensions that we have in relationships. So we can take the interpersonal and then we can transform that into kind of the mass communication, one to many. So we as human beings have this desire for connection and autonomy, and there's this tension, this push and pull for connecting, and then also to remain an individual who I am. I use the picture over here of elephants so that you will remember elephants and the need for love and connection is so great that without it, they die. So with elephants, the need for love and connection is so great that without it, they will die. And we are not that different than elephants. So you as a public speaker, to be a good speaker, what can you do? Harness the power of love and foster togetherness by creating moments of identification with your audience. Identification, what is it more specifically? The moments when speakers and audiences forget their differences and they realize that they're alike in some basic way. So I'm going to say that again. And we need that now more than ever. If we all in this country could understand that we are more alike than we are different. And if we could just put aside, forget our differences for just a little bit and realize that we're all alike in some basic way. And that's how we achieve identification. The route by which we can try to make this happen is to establish common ground. So going back, you have to know who you're talking to, and you have to find a way to be able to relate to them. There is a way. You just have to figure it out. So moving on here, so this is the values iceberg. You know that our values drive our behavior. So make sure your behaviors match your values. So the whole goal, right, for all of us is to make sure that our beliefs are in congruence with our attitudes, are in congruence with our values. That's the goal anyway, but that doesn't always happen. But that's the goal. So a competent influencer, if you can see yourself as an influencer, will maintain trust by aligning to the values of other people. So you need to know what people value. If you look at, it's called BABS, a way to remember when you're analyzing an audience, you want to analyze their beliefs, their attitudes, and their values. So the beliefs are the ideas that we have about reality. They're the easiest to change, so the beliefs that we have. Now, the attitudes are a set of beliefs that kind of cluster around a common object and predispose behavior. There are likes and our dislikes. They're harder to change, actually, than beliefs. And then our values are the hardest to change, and those are the deeply held core beliefs that we have about issues of social justice, about people. An example of a core value that is extremely difficult to change is what our attitude is toward children in the United States. So an example of this is in the United States, we could generally agree that as a culture we value children. Now that doesn't mean that there isn't any type of violence toward children. We know that there is, but generally speaking, as a culture, we value children. We know in the United States that it would not be acceptable for anyone to sell their child into sex slavery so that the family can survive. Correct? We know that generally speaking, the culture would not approve of that. People would feel great shame over doing something like that. Most people would never even think about doing something like that. However, there are some cultures where that is acceptable, and it's a difference in values. So you could say that's wrong. You could disagree with that. So you might be a cultural relativist who said, well, that's the way one culture is, and my culture might be different. Irrespective of how wrong you think that is, my point is that values are the most difficult to change. If someone from that particular culture came to you and said, you need to change, you need to see it this way, you probably will never change your mind because our core values are the most impervious to change. And this just kind of shows you easy to change, the inconsequential beliefs that we have, important beliefs, and then impervious to change. So this just kind of gives you an understanding of how to conceptualize that which will be easier to change and that which is harder to change, so that when you are coming up with your final speech topic, you want to choose a topic in which you are not trying to change a core value. So you do not want to address a core value. And then the last few slides, so feelings. We need to talk about feelings. Isn't that what you always wanted to do? Okay, so Feelings. When we're looking at our audience disposition, you as a speechwriter, you want to examine, analyze your audience's disposition toward the topic and also toward you. So we'll talk more about that in just a minute. But neurologist Antonio Damasci argues that human reason functions in concert with feelings and cannot work without them. So as logical as you think you are, an emotion is going to drive the decision that you make about X, Y, or Z. As logical as you might think you are, emotions are still going to be present, and they are going to play a role in the decisions that you make. So what is the X factor? Your textbook talks about before signing with an NFL team that most quarterbacks had to take a specialized algebra test. I never knew that. And the reason why they did this was to assess their computational skills. Eventually, however, coaches realized that the best quarterbacks weren't necessarily the ones who scored the highest on the math test. Go figure. Rather, it was actually something that was beyond algebra, beyond their ability to computate the statistics of if they throw a pass over here, if they throw a pass over there. So it was beyond that, and it's something called the X factor. And so when they began to ask some of the best quarterbacks how they made their decisions during a play, what they said was that, yes, they do make calculations and decisions as to the play that they were going to make, but also they said that more than anything, it came from a feeling. So this feeling that they had, this gut feeling, and then they went with their gut, they went with the feeling. And what's hard for academics to really wrap their mind around sometimes is that, so the body precedes cognition. So the body can feel it before the brain does. So we can't discount the body. So you can't discount the feeling when you're writing speeches. So emotions do play a role in how your audience is impacted by a message, just as they do as the feeling is part of the X factor in what determines some of our best quarterbacks, or what makes up some of our best quarterbacks. So you as a speechwriter, you want to do a psychological analysis to better understand the psychology, the thinking of your audience, the feeling of your audience. And the last part here is the audience disposition, how the audience feels about you, your topic, and the occasion. What you're speaking about plays a role in how you're going to design your speech and the strategies of persuasion that you're going to use and the examples that you're going to use and the emotional appeals that you're going to use. All of that plays a role. Did you ever think about that? How your audience feels about you affects your message. How your audience feels about your topic affects your message. The occasion, are they being forced to be there? So whatever it might be, you have to take all of these things into consideration because it plays a role in the message, not that you sent, but in the message that your audience receives. And finally, in looking at audience disposition, if you look at page 72, I want you as speechwriters to examine this model, or really not a model, but a breakdown of the speaking situation, because you need to know, how do you best persuade an audience that doesn't like you and they don't like your topic? Does that mean you just don't give the speech? No, it doesn't. But what that means is that you need to approach this group of people who don't like you and who don't like your topic in a way that is different than what you would approach people who do like you and who do like your topic. So we think that that's common sense, but it isn't common to steal from Mark Twain, because oftentimes speechwriters will just write the same speech and not even think about how their audience feels about them and their topic. But you have to, as a speechwriter, you must understand what the audience's disposition is toward you, toward your topic, and toward the occasion. So it's very important for you to look at page 72 on your textbook to look at the different audience dispositions. And finally, you thought it all was never coming. We're getting to the end of this lecture. We talked about a lot today: checking out your speech location, the 3 categories of questions that you need to ask, knowing your audience, gathering information informally and formally from your audience, and audience psychology, how important it is to identify with your audience. And what do we all want to be? We want to be loved. And then finally, we talked about feelings and audience disposition. Know how your audience thinks about you, how do they see you, and how do they see your topic. And I leave you with our final slide. So I will end with Namaste, the light in me sees and honors the light in you. And I'll end with a little song here to get you to remember, or to help you to remember anyway. What does an audience most want?
We wait for it, we heal our wounds and move forward. All we want is love. It breathes for us, it feeds us, even though we don't really know it all. We want is love. All we want is love. All we want is love. It's as light as butterflies, and when we miss it, we fantasize. All we want is love. It wakes us up early in the morning, or helps us sleep all through the night. All